Hello everyone and welcome to my latest SQL Server Quickie. It's already a very long time ago since I have published my last SQL Server Quickie, where I have talked about how you can run SQL Server on Linux. And therefore I want to talk today also about a very interesting possibility how you can use SQL Server these days. And today I want to show you how you can run SQL Server directly in the cloud in Microsoft Azure. And I want to concentrate here today on one specific offering from Microsoft called Azure SQL Database. So let's talk in the first step about what Azure SQL Database is. As the name implies, Azure SQL Database provides you the possibility to run a SQL Server database directly in the cloud. Microsoft provides you here a concept called a logical server. A logical server is more or less the same as a SQL Server instance, and that instance, that logical server, is just based on the latest stable version of SQL Server. And that logical server provides you the same feature set that you already know from your on-premises SQL Server installation. So you have the traditional relational engine that we're already using since decades. You can use intelligent query processing. You have the possibility for more advanced features like in-memory OLTP. You can use column store indexes. So all the features that you have used in the past, they are also available within Azure SQL Database. The cool thing is that Microsoft has also built in scalability options. So when you are deploying an Azure SQL Database, very often, depending on your configuration, how you have configured everything, very often you are getting a SQL Server availability group in the background, which provides you scalability and high availability. So let's switch now over to Microsoft Azure, and I want to show you how easy it is these days to deploy a new Azure SQL database to Microsoft Azure. I'm already logged in here into the Azure portal, which you can reach through portal.azure.com, and now let's just deploy a new Azure SQL database. You can search here for resources, so let's search for SQL database, which we have here. As you can see, I haven't currently deployed any SQL databases in Azure, so let's deploy a new one by clicking here on Create. First of all, as you can see, you have to specify the Azure subscription. This is necessary for billing. As you can see, I have a Visual Studio Professional subscription, which gives me a credit of around $50 every month. I have also a pay-as-you-go subscription, and I'm using here the Visual Studio Professional subscription. You also have to specify a resource group. A resource group in Microsoft Azure is more or less used to group resources into a group. I'm not working here that much with resource groups, so I'm normally placing all my resources in my one and only SQL Passion resource group. In the next step, you have to define the name of your database. So this is the database that you are deploying into your logical server. Let's call our new database SQL-Quickie. Very simple name. And in addition, you also have to specify the logical server to which you want to deploy that database. As you can see, I have created here in the past already a few logical servers which I have spread across the whole world. SQL Bash and DB1 is deployed to North Europe, SQL Bash and DB2 is deployed to Germany West Central, and DB3 to the east coast of the US. I want to deploy my database to SQL Bash and DB1 in North Europe. If you haven't yet created a logical server, you can use that link, create new. Takes a few seconds. And here you can specify your new server. For example, let's call that one SQL Bash and DB4, for example, and that one is accessible through database.windows.net. We will see that later when we are connecting to that logical server. You can specify a location. So for example, I have no idea, let's use here Europe, Sweden Central, and in addition you have to specify how you want to authenticate to that server. When you are thinking on an on-premises SQL Server installation, you also have a few different options. You can use Windows authentication, you can use SQL Server authentication, and the same thing applies here. You can use, for example, Microsoft Entra-only authentication, you can use both SQL and Microsoft Entra authentication, or only SQL authentication. I have deployed the other three servers that I have shown you previously with both SQL and Microsoft Entra authentication. And when you choose SQL authentication, so the second or the third option, you also have to specify an administrator login. So this is more or less your SA account. In my case, that account is called SQL Bash-admin, and I have also chosen here a password, which I don't tell you now, and also not later. So this is very, very important. When you deploy a new logical server, you have to specify the server name, you have to specify the location into which that logical server is deployed, and in addition you have to specify your authentication settings, and afterwards you just hit OK and that logical server is just deployed. We don't need to do that here because we have already 3 servers that we can use. So I'm using here, as I've said previously, SQL Bash and DB1 in North Europe, and then you can specify here a few things, a few configuration options about your new SQL database. You can specify the so-called workload environment, if this is a development or a production environment. This influences how many resources you are getting, if you are getting an availability replica in the background for that database. I'm just staying here on development to keep the costs down. And very, very important is compute and storage. So this is the most important configuration options where you can specify how fast or maybe also how slow your SQL database will react. So let's configure that database. And as you can see, you have here multiple service tiers available. Microsoft Azure provides you here 2 purchasing models. A very simple so-called TTU-based purchasing model. TTU stands for Database Transaction Unit, and the so-called vCore based purchasing model. For very simple, easy, not so performant workloads, you can use the TTU based purchasing model, but as soon as you want to get more performance out of your SQL database, I recommend the vCore based purchasing model. The cool thing about the vCore based purchasing model is that you can specify your compute and storage resources independently from each other. So for example, when we are using here a TTU based purchasing model for example the standard one, you can only specify a so-called DTU, a database transaction unit. So you have here a slider and you can go up and down. Your costs are also going up and down. But this is everything that you can configure. You can't configure how much storage you have, except that slider here, which is also dependent on the number of TTUs. And you also can't define how many vCores, so how many CPU cores you have for that database. So that TTU-based purchasing model is a very, very simple one. As you can see, we can go here up to 3000 TTUs, and with 3000 TTUs, you're just getting 1 terabyte of data space. On the other hand, when we are using here the vCore-based purchasing model, for example, business critical, as you can already see, you have here the highest availability through replicas in the background that you already know from SQL Server Availability Group, and you also have performance. Let's choose that one. And now you can see you have the possibility to define your compute hardware and also your storage requirements independently from each other. Let's change here the configuration. Depending in which region your logical server resides, you have access to one hardware configuration or to the other hardware configuration. As you can see, in North Europe, I have here access to the standard series Gen 5 and the so-called TC series, which is used for confidential computing. We are keeping here the standard series Gen 5, and as you can see now, you can define how many vCores you can get. A vCore is nothing more like a virtual CPU core that you already know from virtualization technologies like VMware or Hyper-V. And as you can see, we can go here up to 128 vCores. And with 128 vCores, you can also specify your maximum data size, which is here already 4 terabytes. So 4 terabytes is just a limitation for an Azure SQL database. If you have the requirement to deploy much larger databases into Microsoft Azure, Microsoft also provides you the so-called hyperscale service tier, and with the hyperscale service tier you can just deploy more larger databases. So as you can see, the maximum here in the business critical service tier, 128 vCores with 4 terabytes of storage. Now you would ask, and what's about memory? Well, there's no memory option. For each vCore, you are getting 5 gigabytes of main memory, of RAM. So with 128 gigabytes, 128 vCores, when we do the math, we would get around 640 gigabytes of RAM. So this is also more or less a restriction of Azure SQL Database. You can't scale CPU and memory resources independently from each other. If you need for your workload more memory, you need more vCores. And of course, each vCore costs you money. As you can see in the business critical service tier, I would pay here for each vCore 212 euros. When I have 128 vCores, I would pay almost 30,000 euros per month for that Azure SQL database. So you have to be very, very, very carefully how you set those sliders. Never ever just go here to the right side of the slider, because the right side costs you a lot of money. So it's very, very important that you have a performant workload, that you have a good indexing strategy in place, because the less resources you are using in a public cloud, the cheaper everything gets. So this is very, very important here. So I'm going here back just to 2 vCores, and with 2 vCores and 1 terabyte of disk space, the estimated cost is around 770 euros per month. As you can see, when we are going down with the storage to the minimum of 1 gigabyte, that database would cost me around 420 euros per month. So for very simple, easy, small databases, this is really, really cheap. But as soon as you need performance, as soon as you need more vCores, more memory, it gets very, very expensive. You can also specify here if you want to have a so-called read scale out, if you want to make that database soon redundant. And of course, everything also changes how much you are paying here for that database. So let's apply those changes, or that default configuration that we have done here. We haven't changed here anything. Only thing we have gone to the business critical service tier. You can also specify your backup redundancy. This is also very, very important. When you're deploying a SQL Azure database, you don't need to perform backups anymore. Yes, you have heard correct. You don't need to perform backups anymore, because backups are happening automatically in the background for you. So Microsoft is making on a regular interval full database backups, differential database backups, transaction log backups, and based on that backup strategy, you can restore, in the case of a failure, your database from those backups. So more or less, when you're deploying a new Azure SQL database, you also have a very good backup strategy already in place, without doing anything on your own. So this is really, really cool. Let's go next to networking. You can also specify firewall rules, how you can access that database. You can also add here so-called private endpoints. We don't need that here. Let's go next to security. You can also use, for example, Microsoft Defender for SQL Server, which also costs you something. So you have to be really, really careful here which checkboxes you are enabling, which ones you don't enable. Let's go next. You can specify here your data source. So this is also very, very important. By default, you are starting just with a blank, empty database. It's the same as when you're doing a create database on an on-premises SQL Server installation. You can also deploy a sample database, our well-known AdventureWorks database, or you can also restore a backup. And this is very, very important here. You can't restore a traditional on-premises SQL Server backup directly to Azure SQL Database. You can only perform a restore from a so-called back-back database. So when you have an existing database on premises, you have to export that database into a so-called back-back file. Then you have to upload that back-back file to a storage account in Azure, and then you can use that back-back file here. So this is a so-called back-back file. Terrible file extension. So this is very, very important. You can't use a regular backup file from an on-premises SQL Server installation to restore that backup file in Microsoft Azure. You have to go that route through back-back files, and this is not really convenient. I don't like that, but that's the way how it's implemented. We are using here none, so we are getting an empty database, no labels, no data, nothing. You can specify your collation, a maintenance window. There's only one maintenance window available. Means within that maintenance window, it's allowed for Microsoft to perform failovers for your database. Let's go to next. Here you can specify tags. So for example, a key value pair, for example, the owner of that database and who is that owner of that database. Afterwards, we go to review and create. You can see now your estimated costs, all the information that we have done. And now we just hit create, and this triggers now the deployment of that Azure SQL database. As you can see, we have here now a deployment in progress. This shouldn't take that much time. So as you can see, we are deploying here our SQL Quickie database to my logical server SQL Bastion TP1, which is deployed to North Europe. So let's wait until that deployment is finished. As you can see, the deployment is now finished. It took around 1 to 2 minutes, so not that much time. So let's go now here to our deployed resource. This is our SQL Quickie database on my logical server SQL Bastion TP1. As you can see, you see here again the resource group, status, subscription, and so on. You have your pricing tier, and now let's try to connect to that database. I'm using here Azure Data Studio. You can also use SQL Server Management Studio. Doesn't matter which tool you're using here. And let's pass in our connection details. The name of our server is SQL Bastion-TP1, database windows.net, so the same that we have already seen previously. You can specify, of course, the authentication type. Let's use here SQL login. As you know, my SQL login is SQL Bastion admin, and I have a password that I don't tell you. And now we just hit connect. And as you can see, we are now connected to that logical server SQL Bastion TP1 database.windows.net, which is running in Microsoft Azure. When we expand the databases folder, you can see here we have our SQL Quickie database. It's empty, no tables, nothing. So it's very, very easy to deploy a new database. You can also deploy new databases to a logical server through the SQL statements. So you can also use a create database command, and within the create database command you can also specify the service tier and everything that we have done and configured previously through the Azure portal. You can also drop your database within Azure Data Studio through a drop database command. So this also works. So you can also do everything programmatically that you know from the past. So here we have now a newly deployed database, and it's up to you now what you are doing with that database. I hope that you have enjoyed today's SQL Server Quickie, and as you have seen, it's very easy these days to deploy new databases to Microsoft Azure with Azure SQL Database. If you want to learn more about how to use SQL Server in Microsoft Azure, I highly recommend to check out my online training, which I'm running on November 27 and 28 this year, and within those 2 days I want to cover almost everything that you have to know about how to run SQL Server in the cloud in Microsoft Azure. So we are starting here with running SQL Server installations in Azure virtual machines. Afterwards I will talk in very deep way about how to use Azure SQL Database. that you have seen today in this SQL Server Quickie. We will also talk about the hyperscale service tier that I have mentioned previously and briefly in that SQL Server Quickie, and we will also talk about the SQL managed instance, which gives you a fully SQL Server instance in the cloud with SQL Server agent jobs and just everything. So this is more or less just a SQL Server instance that is running natively in the cloud. So if you are interested, please check out my online training about it, which I'm running from November 27 to 28 this year. So thanks for watching my SQL Server Quickie. I hope that you have a lot of fun, that you have learned a few more new things about SQL Server, and I'm already looking forward to see you in my next SQL Server Quickie or in one of my upcoming online trainings. Thank you.